Hi, Audrey.
Hi.
Yeah, so tell us about your book, Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit and the Mughal Empire.
So, Culture of Encounters tells the story about how the Mughals became deeply involved with the Sanskrit cultural sphere. And what really distinguishes the Mughals' interest in Sanskrit is sort of how many different ways it manifested itself. So, the Mughals sponsored Jain and Brahmin intellectuals at their imperial court. They patronized the translation of Sanskrit text into Persian. They sponsored the production of original works written in Sanskrit. And this went on for a roughly 100-year period, from about 1560 until 1660. These days, most people in the popular sphere and historians alike think of the Mughals as sort of Islamic, Persianate, full stop, end of story. And Culture of Encounters tells about a different angle of the Mughals.
So who did Akbar commission ask to sort of translate the Mahabharata?
Sorry, say that again.
Who did Akbar ask to translate the Mahabharata? Because there are various versions. Where are the Brahmins, or where are the Jains who did the translation?
Right. So there was sort of a team involved in the translation effort. Right. The Mahabharata is a little bit too long for any one individual involved. So we do have the names of all of the translators. It's a group of about 4 to 5 people on the Mughal side, and then again, I think it's 4 people on the Sanskrit side.
Headed by Badauni.
So Badauni is one of the people. He only does 2 of the books out
but he was
of
one
the
of the main
18
people, is it?
books. Sorry?
He was one of the main translators.
Correct. Badauni was commissioned to do more translations of Sanskrit text than any other Mughal official in Akbar's court, which is sort of curious because Badauni really hated translating Sanskrit materials. But yeah, and then the Mahabharata translation process is sort of interesting. Nobody involved knew both languages, and so the way that this worked was the Brahmin Pandits sat there, they had the Sanskrit text in front of them, they read it, they verbally translated it into Hindi, that was the shared language of communication. The Mughal side heard it in Hindi and then wrote it down in Persian. And we have this attested to in 3 different ways. There's a colophon to the translation that describes the process. We have a nice illustration that illustrates what this looks like, and there's also linguistic evidence in the text that confirms especially the verbal Hindi part of the translation process. There are certain words that are Sanskrit words that are transliterated into Persian, but they're done so with a sort of Hindi pronunciation.
But they retain a lot of Hindi words. The Sanskrit words, like there's Naraka and there's Purana.
Yeah,
I remember reading about that.
They retained thousands.
So why did they do
Sanskrit
that?
words.
Because we had Hindi words for that.
Right. So I read about this in the book. So in some cases, I think it was a sort of cultural specificity. Right. Naraka is not quite the same thing, as this Persian equivalent, right?
Yeah.
But in other cases, one example I give But like an example I give in the book, for instance, is Pitr, right? The Sanskrit word for father. You can obviously translate that as Pida into Persian, and they do in some cases, but in others they retain the Sanskrit. Maybe this was a sort of, flavor of authenticity. Translators often use that.
But they changed the name of Brahma. It has been changed to Khuda.
Only in some cases.
Only in some cases. Why is that?
So,
why in just some cases?
The Mughals were very inconsistent with their approach to religious elements of the Sanskrit epic. And I argue basically that they didn't have a religious agenda vis-a-vis the text. They were simply trying to understand it as best they could, right? Everybody always understands things through their own lens. And I think for the Mughals it was difficult to think outside of a monotheistic framework.
So they were sort of catering to a monotheistic audience. So they were trying to sort of reconcile the Mahabharata. So
I argue in the book, I don't think that there is enough textual evidence to make the case that this was a deliberate attempt. I think it was probably a little bit more unconscious, or at least a little bit more uneven, right? So, you do get these sort of interesting tidbits at certain points, right? So in one part of the text, for example, we have the Hindu god Surya who petitions Khorab, right? So you get these kind of interesting mixtures. It's not always kind of supplanting.
But I also remember reading about Akbar being very upset with Badauni over something, like he tell me about it, yeah.
Correct. So the sort of mini translation trial, as I call it. So the Mughals they inserted verses of quoted Persian poetry. Okay, this was a standard translation tactic. At one point, Badauni puts in a half line by Hafez. Okay? So that's fine, except for what it says. Okay, the line says basically everybody gets what they deserve. Right, good deeds get a good reward, bad deeds get a bad reward. This half line had traditionally been understood in the Persianate tradition to refer to the Islamic Day of Judgment. right? Good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. So Akbar hears this part of the epic read out in translation at court, and he says, wait a minute, this is Islamic. This is not a Hindu idea. This is not in the original Sanskrit epic. So he hauls Badauni into court, and Badauni made his case. And Badauni's argument was actually, Shah Akbar, this idea is in the Mahabharata, because at the end of the epic there is a heaven, there is a hell, and you go one place or the other in accordance with your deeds. And in this case, Badauni won. That half line remains in the Persian translation. Akbar was convinced. But the episode sort of shows...
won in this case.
He did. But it's sort of, the episode kind of points up the limits of translation, right? And the limits of transculturation. And, we try to bring text, the Mughals did it, we try today to bring text across, cultural and linguistic boundaries. But at some point, the understanding usually breaks down, right? And this was one point where it did.
So tell us about your next book. I believe it's on Aurangzeb, and it releases next month.
That is correct. So it comes out February 17th, being published by Penguin India, Aurangzeb, the Man and the Myth.
Yeah. So who was Aurangzeb, and tell us about the myth? I mean, do you think he's really misunderstood? Why do you think he's so hated?
Well,
amongst Mughal emperors, he was the most hated.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he's easily India's most reviled pre-modern king. So I think that there are a lot of reasons. Many actions that Aurangzeb took are incredibly offensive and objectionable, according to 21st century standards. That is true of every pre-modern ruler in Indian history. In fact, every pre-modern ruler in the history of the world. But why is the attention focused on Aurangzeb? A lot of that has to do with colonial era ideas. The British demonized the Mughals as a way to sort of claim that they were more civil and better by comparison. And that is an idea, defending the British Empire doesn't find many takers in India these days, but demonizing,
so are you saying
Muslims.
That we hate him more than we should?
Well, my argument would be that I don't see much value in hating kings that died several hundred years ago, right? There are many more interesting questions to ask about the past than do we like this guy. Aurangzeb was the most important political figure, arguably, of the 17th century, right? He arguably played a major role in, setting up the Mughal Empire to break apart, and certainly expanded the Mughal Empire to its greatest extent geographically. And so I want to know about him. I want to know about him as a king and as a ruler. I am not concerned with whether we like him or dislike him. I'm much more concerned with explaining him in historical terms.
So a lot of our history textbooks are being rewritten, especially when it comes to history about Mughals. So what do you think about that?
I think I'm solidly against the political rewriting of history.
Anywhere in the world. Not just us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. This is not unique to India.
Even our roads are being renamed, like the Aurangzeb road has been renamed.
Yeah, shockingly, I wasn't heavily in favor of that. I don't know that I have a very clear opinion on what we should do vis-a-vis, names of streets and public,
But I thought you wrote about it then.
I don't think I explicitly wrote about the renaming of Aurangzeb right now. No. Here's what I would say. I think that the way to deal with a history with which you are uncomfortable is not to forget it. And partly that's true. That's because it doesn't work. And I think that the sort of growing public interest in Aurangzeb proves my point, right? Erasing the name of Aurangzeb Road has hardly caused some sort of, India-wide amnesia about Aurangzeb. On the contrary, people are more hungry to know about him than ever, right?
So is this going to be the first tell-all book on Aurangzeb?
I don't know if it's tell-all. I think that it is a book. It's based on solid historical research. Nobody has written a sort of serious historical biography of Aurangzeb in a number of decades.
Like the way nobody had written about Akbar the way you did.
Yeah, the two projects are obviously different in certain respects. I will say I do not want the final word on Aurangzeb, right? This is a book that has certain goals, it has certain limitations. I am open always to changing my beliefs and opinions as a historian.
So your first book apparently was an extension of your doctoral thesis.
That's correct.
Yeah, so you say that you took about 10 years, like, the theory research and, your PhD and then
correct.
The actual writing took about 10 years. So how long did you take to research and write this book?
Aurangzeb, 2 years. Yeah, so a much briefer period of time. Partly that is because I realized when I decided to write about Aurangzeb, I realized that I had been thinking about him for a decade already. The first book ends with his ascension, however, right? I mean, there's 5 pages on Aurangzeb and why I am there, and that's it. And so, I realize I have all these thoughts and ideas about this guy that I've never put in writing before, right? So, I mean, the gestation period of the book is sort of, it seems less than perhaps it actually is.
After Aurangzeb?
So after Aurangzeb, I think I'm moving away from the Mughals for a little bit. My third book project is on Sanskrit histories of Indo-Islamic rule more broadly. This will include the Mughals, but I will start in the late 12th century with the Delhi Sultanate rulers.
So are you excited about the Aurangzeb book?
Oh, I'm absolutely very excited about it.
See you again in India.
I certainly hope so. I enjoy visiting India immensely, and I certainly hope to come back very soon.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.